The kitchen floor was cold against my cheek. I remember that detail clearly, the cold and the way my mother's heels clicked slowly toward me as my chest burned like someone had poured acid inside my rib cage. "Mom, please, call 911." My voice came out broken, barely a whisper. My vision was tunneling darkness creeping in from the edges. I was 36 years old, dying on my parents' kitchen floor, and my mother just stood there, watching. "Stop being dramatic, Dana. You're ruining dinner." My brother Trevor laughed from the table. "She always needs to be the center of attention." I reached for my phone. My mother moved it away. I'll never forget her eyes in that moment, cold, calculating, almost hopeful. 3 days later, at my grandfather's will reading, I understood why. The doors opened. Police officers walked in with a sealed box and a woman I'd never seen before. "We have new information," one officer announced. "Who here is Helen?" My mother's face went white. "Have you ever discovered that everything you believed about your family was a lie?" "My name is Dana Holland. I'm 36 years old, a senior financial analyst at one of Boston's top investment firms. On paper, I have everything: a successful career, my own apartment, financial independence. But none of that ever mattered to my family. To them, I've always been invisible. Growing up in the Holland household meant understanding your place early. My younger brother Trevor was the sun, and the rest of us simply orbited around him. When Trevor failed his classes, my parents hired tutors and blamed the teachers. When I graduated top of my class, my mother forgot to attend the ceremony. When Trevor's business ventures collapsed 3 times, my father wrote checks without question. When I earned my first promotion, no one asked what I actually did for a living. I learned young that silence was easier than fighting for attention that would never come. So I stopped fighting. I became the daughter who showed up when required, smiled when expected, and disappeared when convenient. My father Richard has always been a man of few words, at least with me. He defers to my mother Helen on everything: what we eat, where we go, who matters. And according to Helen, I have never mattered. Her coldness toward me goes beyond simple favoritism. There's something almost hostile in the way she looks at me, a wall so thick I stopped trying to climb it decades ago. I used to think she was just a difficult woman. Now I know better. When Grandpa Walter got sick last year, I wanted to visit him every week. He was the only person in my family who ever made me feel seen. But Helen always had an excuse. "He's too tired. The doctor said no visitors. You'll only stress him out." Meanwhile, Trevor came and went as he pleased. I tried calling Grandpa directly, but somehow Helen always answered his phone. "He's resting, Dana. I'll tell him you called." I wonder now if she ever did. 2 weeks before he died, something strange happened. My phone rang at 11 at night, Grandpa's number. His voice was weak but urgent in a way I'd never heard before. "Dana, listen to me. There's something about your family you need to know, about who you really—" Then Helen's voice, sharp as a blade. "Dad, you need to rest. I'll call Dana later." The line went dead. I called back 6 times. I sent texts. Nothing. For 2 weeks, I tried to reach him, and then he was gone, and whatever he wanted to tell me died with him. Or so I thought. The funeral was 3 days ago. Helen insisted on a family dinner that night to discuss arrangements. I didn't want to go, but I went anyway, the dutiful daughter performing her role one more time. We were halfway through the meal when the pain started. Pressure in my chest, sharp and sudden. It spread to my shoulder, my arm. The room began to spin. I couldn't catch my breath. "Mom?" I managed, gripping the edge of the table. "Something's wrong. I need you to call 911. Helen didn't move. Her eyes met mine across the table, and what I saw there still haunts me. No concern, no fear, just cold, patient calculation. "Stop being dramatic, Dana. You're ruining dinner." I reached for my phone. Helen slid it down the table, away from my grasp. "Classic Dana," Trevor said with a laugh, "always needing to be the center of attention." The floor rushed up to meet me. I remember the cold tile against my cheek, the taste of copper in my mouth, the darkness closing in from every direction. And through it all, I remember Helen standing over me, her heels clicking slowly closer, her face completely expressionless. She watched me dying, and she did nothing. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that someone else was watching too. Someone parked outside in the darkness, someone who had been monitoring my family for 18 months. Someone who saw Helen's face through that dining room window and recognized it for what it was. The look of someone who wanted a problem to disappear. I woke to the sound of beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic, white ceiling tiles, fluorescent lights, the steady rhythm of a heart monitor confirming what seemed impossible: I was still alive. A nurse noticed me stirring and called for the doctor. He was a kind-faced man in his 50s who pulled a chair beside my bed and explained what had happened to me in terms I could understand. Acute pericarditis with early cardiac tamponade, he said. Fluid had been building around my heart, squeezing it, preventing it from pumping properly. That was why my blood pressure crashed. That was why I collapsed. He told me that 15 more minutes without treatment would have been fatal. 15 minutes. I had come that close to dying on my mother's kitchen floor while she watched and did nothing. The doctor said something else that made me pause. Someone had called 911 that night, an anonymous caller who described my symptoms and my exact location with unusual precision. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes because the caller had been so specific, so urgent. Whoever it was knew exactly what was happening to me, he said. They may have saved your life. I asked if he knew who called. He shook his head. The number was blocked, and the caller hung up immediately after giving the information. I lay there trying to make sense of it. My parents had refused to help me. Trevor had laughed. So who had been watching? Who had cared enough to make that call? My parents finally showed up 2 days after I was admitted. 2 days. I had nearly died, and they could not be bothered to visit for 48 hours. When they walked into my hospital room, there was no relief on their faces, no tears, no rushing to my bedside. My father hung back near the door, looking uncomfortable, checking his watch. But it was my mother's expression that I will never forget. For just a moment, a fraction of a second before she composed herself, I saw something flicker across Helen's face. It was not concern. It was not love. It looked almost like disappointment, like she had expected a different outcome and was now recalculating. She recovered quickly, of course. She always does. Dana, you gave us quite a scare, she said, her voice flat. The doctors say you're fine now. We should discuss when you can be discharged. There are arrangements to finalize for your grandfather's estate. No asking how I felt. No apology for not calling 911. No acknowledgement that I had almost died in her kitchen while she moved my phone out of reach. Just business, just logistics, just Helen. They left after 20 minutes. I told myself I was used to it. That night, unable to sleep, I opened the small drawer in my bedside table looking for a pen to write down the doctor's instructions. Instead, I found an envelope that had not been there before. My name was written on the front, in handwriting I recognized instantly: Grandpa Walter's distinctive script, the same elegant letters he used on every birthday card he ever sent me. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. My dear girl, it read, I never forgot you. They kept us apart, but the truth will find you. When you are ready, find Margaret Sullivan. She has everything. I am sorry I could not tell you sooner. Know that you were always loved. Always. He had signed it simply, Grandpa. I read those words 5 times trying to understand. They kept us apart. Who kept us apart? What truth? And who was Margaret Sullivan? I had never heard that name in my life. But someone had placed this envelope in my hospital room, which meant someone had access to me while I was unconscious. Someone who knew Grandpa. Someone who was watching over me even now. The same person who called 911. It had to be. For the first time, I began to understand that my family's treatment of me was not just dysfunction or favoritism. Something had been actively hidden from me, something important enough that my grandfather hired a stranger to deliver his message from beyond the grave. I was discharged 3 days later. The will reading was scheduled for the following morning. Helen called me the night before, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Dana, I wanted to prepare you, she said. I spoke with the lawyer, and it seems your grandfather left you almost nothing. He was so disappointed that you never visited him. You know how hurt he was that you didn't make time for him. My stomach turned. I had tried to visit him dozens of times. Helen always had an excuse. I remembered driving 4 hours on his 80th birthday, arriving at the house with flowers and his favorite cake, only to have Helen meet me at the door. He is not feeling well, she had said. Maybe next time. She never even let me inside. I drove home crying, convinced my grandfather did not want to see me. Now I wondered, did he even know I came? Had Helen told him I was there? Or had she let him believe I did not care the same way she was letting me believe He did not care about me. Everything I thought I knew about my family was crumbling. The next morning, I arrived at the law office of Morrison and Associates. The conference room was small and wood-paneled, filled with the kind of heavy furniture meant to convey importance. My parents were already seated when I walked in along with Trevor, who was drumming his fingers impatiently on the table. Helen glanced at me with that familiar, cold appraisal. Richard did not look up at all. Attorney Morrison was a serious man with gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He thanked us for coming and explained that Walter Holland had made significant changes to his will approximately 6 months before his death, along with specific instructions for how today's reading should proceed. Trevor leaned forward, already calculating his share. Helen sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Morrison began reading. There were small bequests to various charities, a donation to the local library, some personal items distributed to old friends. Then he reached the primary estate, Holland Properties, the investment accounts, the family home. Trevor's name came first. He was to receive a fixed sum of $50,000, nothing more. Trevor erupted. "That is ridiculous. I am his grandson. There must be some mistake." Morrison waited for him to finish, then continued reading in the same measured tone. "The remainder of my estate," he read, "including all properties, investments, and holdings, is designated for Dana Holland pending legal verification of her status as sole blood heir." I felt the room tilt. "I don't understand," I said. "What does blood heir mean? Trevor is his grandson too. We are both his grandchildren." Helen's knuckles went white as she gripped the arms of her chair. Richard stared at the table. Trevor was still sputtering about his $50,000, but I barely heard him. I was watching my mother's face, watching the mask slip, watching something like fear creep into her eyes. Attorney Morrison removed his glasses and looked directly at me. "Ms. Holland," he said carefully, "the will contains specific language that I am not at liberty to fully explain. However, your grandfather left instructions that a particular individual should be present for this reading." He glanced toward the door. "I believe she has arrived." The conference room door opened. A woman in her early 60s stepped inside carrying a weathered wooden box marked with Grandpa Walter's initials. Behind her stood 2 uniformed police officers. The woman had sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked at each of us in turn before her gaze settled on Helen with something like contempt. "My name is Margaret Sullivan," she said. "I am a retired private investigator. Walter Holland hired me 18 months ago to uncover the truth about his family." She set the box on the conference table with a heavy thud. "Helen, would you like to tell Dana who she really is, or should I?" Helen's face drained of all color. For the first time in my life, I saw real fear in my mother's eyes. Not the controlled displeasure I had grown up with, not the cold calculation I had witnessed on the kitchen floor. This was raw, naked terror. Margaret Sullivan did not wait for an answer. She pulled a chair to the head of the conference table, positioning herself where everyone could see her clearly. Since Helen seems to have lost her voice, she said, "I will start from the beginning." She looked at me with something almost like compassion. "Dana, what I am about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about your life. I need you to listen carefully." I nodded, unable to speak. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Margaret began her explanation in a calm, measured tone. 18 months ago, she said, Walter Holland contacted her through a mutual friend. He had been organizing the belongings of his late son Thomas, clearing out boxes that had been stored in the attic for decades. In one of those boxes, he found something that did not make sense, documents that contradicted everything he believed about his family. He hired Margaret to investigate quietly, to gather evidence before confronting anyone. Her job was to uncover the truth and to monitor Dana's safety, especially during family gatherings, when tensions ran high. "I was parked outside your parents' house the night you collapsed," Margaret said, her eyes never leaving mine. "I watched through the dining room window. I saw you fall, and I saw your mother stand over you for nearly 30 seconds, watching you struggle to breathe before she turned and walked back to the table." Margaret's voice hardened as she looked at Helen. "You wanted her to die. I saw it on your face. That is when I called 911. Helen opened her mouth to protest, but one of the police officers stepped forward and she fell silent. Margaret reached into the wooden box and began removing its contents. There were stacks of documents, old photographs with curled edges, official-looking papers with stamps and signatures, and a small digital voice recorder. She held up the recorder for everyone to see. Walter recorded this message 6 months ago, she said. He wanted Dana to hear the truth in his own words in case he did not live long enough to tell her himself. She pressed play. Grandpa Walter's voice filled the room, and my eyes immediately filled with tears. He sounded tired, but determined the way he always sounded when something important needed to be said. Dana, my dear girl, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and you finally know the truth. I am so sorry I could not tell you while I was alive. I tried. God knows I tried. But they kept us apart, and by the time I discovered why my health was already failing, he paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. Dana, you are not Helen and Richard's biological daughter. You are my granddaughter by blood. You are the daughter of my son Thomas and his wife Linda. They died 36 years ago, just days apart. Thomas was killed in a car accident when Linda was 7 months pregnant with you. Linda gave birth to you prematurely and died 2 days later from complications. You were alone in that hospital, just 2 days old, with no family left to claim you, or so everyone believed. I could not breathe. The room seemed to be spinning around me. I gripped the arms of my chair and forced myself to keep listening. The recording continued. Helen took you from the hospital 2 days after Linda died. She bribed a staff member and falsified your birth certificate to make it look like you were born to her and Richard. Richard knew you were adopted, but Helen told him you were an orphan, a baby with no family, no history. He never knew you were Thomas's daughter. He never knew you were my granddaughter. Helen kept that secret because she knew that if I ever found out, everything would change. She knew I would have taken you in myself. She knew she would have lost everything. Margaret stopped the recording and turned to face Richard. His face was gray, his hands trembling on the table. You knew Dana was adopted? Margaret said. It was not a question. Richard nodded slowly, looking like a man whose entire world had just collapsed. Helen told me the birth mother was a young woman who died in childbirth. He said, his voice barely above a whisper. She said there was no family, no one to claim the baby. She said we were giving Dana a home, a chance at a good life. He looked at Helen with something between horror and disgust. You told me she was nobody. You never said she was Thomas's child. You never said she was Walter's granddaughter. Helen said nothing. She just sat there, her mask finally crumbling, tears streaming down her face. But Margaret was not finished. She pulled more items from the boxed journals, photographs, college yearbooks. There is one more truth Dana needs to understand, she said. The truth about why Helen treated her the way she did for 31 years. She spread the photographs across the table. I saw images of young people in graduation robes at parties smiling at the camera. 3 faces appeared again and again, a younger Helen, a younger Richard, and a handsome young man with kind eyes who looked startlingly familiar. Helen, Thomas, and Richard were all classmates in college, Margaret explained, and Helen was in love with Thomas. I looked at the photographs more closely. In several of them, Helen was standing close to Thomas, looking at him with obvious adoration, but Thomas was always looking somewhere else, at someone else. A beautiful young woman with dark hair and a warm smile. Linda, my mother. Thomas chose Linda, Margaret continued. He married her despite his family's objections, despite Helen's attempts to come between them. Helen married Richard, but she never stopped resenting Linda for taking the man she wanted. And when Thomas and Linda died, when Helen took you from that hospital, I believe part of her saw it as finally winning. She finally had something that belonged to Thomas. Margaret's voice grew cold. But when you were 5 years old, Helen found old photographs of Linda while cleaning out a closet. That was when she realized you were growing up to look exactly like your mother. Every time Helen looked at you, she saw Linda. She saw the woman Thomas chose instead of her, and you became the target of 31 years of jealousy and resentment. Everything suddenly made sense. The coldness that had always been there, the way Helen looked at me like I was something unpleasant she could not get rid of, the wall between us that I could never climb no matter how hard I tried. It was never about me. It was about Linda. It was about a jealousy so deep and so twisted that Helen had punished me my entire life for the crime of looking like my own mother. Attorney Morrison cleared his throat. There is one final matter, he said. He held up an official document. After learning of these allegations, Dana voluntarily provided a DNA sample for testing. The results have been verified by an independent laboratory and certified by the court. He looked directly at me. Dana Holland is confirmed as the biological granddaughter of Walter Holland, his only living blood relative. According to the terms of his will and under state inheritance law, she is the sole legal heir to his entire estate. This includes Holland properties, all investment accounts, and the family home. The room erupted into chaos. Trevor jumped to his feet, screaming that this was fraud, that I had somehow manipulated a dying old man. Richard sat frozen in his chair, still trying to process 36 years of lies. And Helen reached for me, tears streaming down her face, her hands grasping at my arm. "Dana, please," she sobbed. "I can explain. I loved you. I did love you. I stepped back from her touch. My voice came out cold and steady, surprising even myself. "You stood over me while I was dying," I said. "You watched me struggle to breathe on your kitchen floor. You waited. You moved the phone so I could not call for help." I turned to Attorney Morrison. "Document everything, every crime, every lie, every piece of evidence." Then I looked at Helen one final time. "You had 36 years to tell me the truth. Now I am going to make sure everyone knows it." The weeks that followed the will reading were the most difficult and the most liberating of my entire life. I had spent 36 years believing I was unwanted, unloved, the difficult daughter who could never measure up. Now I knew the truth. I was never the problem. I had been the victim of a calculated scheme designed to erase me from my own family, and I was determined to make sure justice was served. I hired my own attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Owens, who specialized in estate law and fraud cases. She worked closely with Margaret Sullivan, and together they began documenting the full scope of Helen's 36-year conspiracy. What they uncovered was even worse than I had imagined. Helen had not simply neglected me or favored Trevor. She had systematically worked to destroy any relationship I might have had with my grandfather, manipulating both of us with lies so consistent and so convincing that neither of us ever suspected the truth. Margaret showed me the evidence she had gathered during her 18 months of investigation. There were emails Helen had sent to Grandpa Walter. Over the years, emails I never knew existed. In them, Helen claimed that I had said terrible things about him, that I resented him for not giving me money, that I had told her I never wanted to see him again. None of it was true. I had never said any of those things. But Grandpa Walter had believed them, because why would his daughter-in-law lie about something so serious? Margaret also found records of phone calls, dozens of them over the years, where I had tried to reach Grandpa directly, and Helen had intercepted. She would answer his phone, tell me he was sleeping or too sick for visitors, and then never pass along my messages. She did the same thing to him, telling him I was too busy to talk or that I had canceled plans to visit. We spent 30 years missing each other, each believing the other did not care, and Helen was the architect of every misunderstanding. The financial evidence was equally damning. My attorney discovered that Helen had been redirecting funds from Holland properties for years, funneling company money into accounts earmarked for Trevor's failed business ventures. She had co-signed loans totaling nearly $280,000, loans that Trevor never repaid, loans that were quietly written off as business losses while the money disappeared into his pockets. Helen had always anticipated that Trevor would inherit everything, so she treated the family business like her personal bank account. She never expected anyone to look closely at the books. She certainly never expected me to inherit and discover what she had done. When my attorney presented these findings, her assessment was clear. This was not just manipulation. This was embezzlement and fraud. Helen had stolen from a company that was never hers to steal from, and she had done it systematically over many years. My response was simple. They would repay every cent, not because I needed the money, but because actions have consequences. Trevor and Helen would face the same repayment terms as any other debtor. No special treatment, no family discount, justice. But the most serious matter was still the night I almost died. Margaret's testimony about what she witnessed through the dining room window was powerful, but testimony alone might not be enough for criminal charges. Then my attorney received an unexpected piece of evidence. A neighbor across the street had a doorbell camera that captured video footage of the Holland house that night. The camera's view included part of the dining room window, and when investigators enhanced the footage, the timeline became undeniable. The video showed me collapsing at the table. It showed Helen standing over me for nearly 30 seconds without moving. It showed her stepping back, picking up my phone, and placing it at the far end of the table, and it showed her returning to her seat and resuming her meal while I lay motionless on the floor. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. Helen had not frozen in panic. She had made a deliberate choice not to help me, and had actively prevented me from helping myself. The district attorney reviewed the case personally. She explained that in most states, there is no legal duty to rescue someone in distress, even a family member. But Helen's case was different. She had not simply failed to act, she had actively interfered with my ability to call for help by moving my phone away. Under the law, that constituted reckless endangerment. Combined with the evidence that Helen had motive, Margaret testified that Helen had overheard Grandpa Walter on the phone, discussing plans to reveal the truth to me. The case pointed towards something more serious than mere negligence. The district attorney told my attorney she was considering charges that could result in significant prison time. 3 weeks after the will reading, I gathered the extended family together. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who had known me my whole life, but had always treated me as the outsider, the difficult one, the daughter who could never get along with her mother. They came expecting family drama. What they got was documented evidence of 36 years of criminal behavior. I stood at the front of my grandfather's living room, my living room now, and presented the facts without emotion. I showed them the falsified birth certificate that proved Helen had taken me illegally from the hospital. I showed them the intercepted communications that proved she had deliberately kept me and Grandpa Walter apart. I showed them the financial records that proved she had embezzled from the family business. And I showed them the doorbell camera footage from the night I collapsed. I let them watch Helen stand over me, watch her move my phone, watch her sit back down while I lay dying on the floor. The room was silent when I finished. My Aunt Patricia, Helen's own sister, was crying. My cousin Mark looked like he might be sick. No one defended Helen. No one tried to explain away what they had seen. The evidence was too clear, too overwhelming, too impossible to deny. I addressed them one final time. Helen did not just favor Trevor, I said. She committed crimes to ensure I would never receive what was legally mine. She kept me from my grandfather for 30 years, letting each of us believe the other did not care. And when I collapsed in her kitchen, she saw an opportunity to make the problem disappear forever. I paused to let the words sink in. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you because you deserve to know the truth about the woman you trusted. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. I walked out of the room without looking back. Helen's carefully constructed reputation, the image of the devoted wife and loving mother she had maintained for decades, crumbled in minutes. By the end of the week, she had been dropped from her charity boards, uninvited from her social clubs, and quietly removed from the church committee she had chaired for 15 years. The community that once admired her now whispered about her crimes. Justice was being served one consequence at a time. 3 weeks later, I received a phone call from Attorney Morrison. His voice was gentle, almost hesitant. "Dana, we found one more item in your grandfather's safe deposit box," he said. "He left specific instructions that it should only reach you after you knew the truth about your identity." I drove to his office immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Morrison handed me an aged envelope, yellowed with time, sealed with tape that had grown brittle over the decades. "This has been in that box for 36 years, he said quietly. "Your grandfather never opened it. He was saving it for you." My hands trembled as I broke the seal and removed the letter inside. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, faded, but still legible. It was dated 36 years ago, just weeks before my birth. And it began with words that made my eyes fill with tears before I had even read the first sentence. "To my daughter, whom I may never meet." I took the letter home to Grandpa Walter's house, my house now, and sat alone in his study as the evening light faded through the windows. For a long time, I just held the envelope, afraid to read what was inside, afraid of what I might feel. Then I unfolded the delicate paper and let my mother's words reach me across 36 years of silence. "My darling daughter," she wrote, "if you are reading this, it means I could not stay with you. The doctors say my pregnancy is high risk, and with your father gone, I have no one left to help me through what comes next. I am writing this letter because I need you to know the truth in case I am not there to tell you myself. From the moment I felt you move inside me, you were wanted, you were loved, you were never an accident or a burden. You were the greatest joy your father and I ever knew even before we met you. Thomas was the kindest man I have ever known. He loved me when his family disapproved, married me when they told him not to, and dreamed of building a life with me that was ours alone. He would have been the most wonderful father. I wish you could have known him. I wish I could have watched you grow up together. But life does not always give us what we wish for. What I can give you is this truth: you deserve love. You deserve happiness. You are not unwanted. You are not a burden. You are my greatest gift to this world. Whoever raises you, wherever life takes you, please remember that your mother loved you with everything she had, and I will keep loving you even from wherever I am for as long as forever lasts. I read those words over and over until I had memorized every line. Then I cried, not from grief, not from anger, but from something I had never felt before: the deep healing release of finally understanding. I was never the problem. I was never unlovable. I was never the difficult daughter who could not measure up. I was wanted from my very first heartbeat by parents who loved me more than their own lives. Everything Helen made me believe about myself was a lie. The truth was written in my mother's handwriting, saved for 36 years, waiting for me to find it. The legal proceedings moved forward over the following weeks. Helen's crimes had attracted federal attention when investigators discovered the pattern of falsified emails she had sent across state lines for decades. What began as a state-level fraud case expanded into federal charges for mail fraud, adding to the existing charges of forgery, embezzlement, and reckless endangerment. Helen's attorneys tried to negotiate, tried to minimize, tried to paint her as a grieving woman who had made mistakes out of love. The judge was not persuaded. He noted the 36-year duration of her crimes, the systematic cruelty toward an innocent child, and the deliberate choice to let me die on her kitchen floor when helping me would have cost her nothing. He sentenced Helen to 30 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She was ordered to pay $175,000 in restitution and was permanently barred from contacting me in any way. When the sentence was read, Helen collapsed in tears. I felt nothing. She had 36 years to tell me the truth. She chose lies instead. Richard filed for divorce the week after Helen's sentencing. He had been deceived too, he said, and I believe that much was true. He never knew I was Thomas's daughter. He never knew I was Walter's granddaughter. But his willful blindness to my suffering was something he would have to live with for the rest of his life. He had watched Helen treat me with coldness and contempt for 3 decades and never once asked why. He had deferred to her on everything, including the systematic destruction of my relationship with my own grandfather. Richard was not a monster like Helen, but he was a coward, and cowardice has its own consequences. Trevor's fall was perhaps the most complete. The golden child who had never faced a consequence in his life was suddenly drowning in them. He was forced to sell his luxury apartment to begin repaying the $280,000 he owed to Holland Properties. He took a regular job for the first time in his adult life, working in an office like millions of other people, earning a salary that would go toward his debt for the next 15 years. No more bailouts, no more excuses, no more special treatment. Trevor finally learned what the rest of us always knew: actions have consequences, and no one is entitled to a life they have not earned. I poured my energy into building something meaningful from the wreckage of my past. I renovated Grandpa Walter's house from top to bottom, transforming it from a place of painful memories into a true home. I filled the walls with photographs: Grandpa Walter, smiling in his garden; Thomas and Linda on their wedding day, my parents holding each other with a love so obvious it radiated from the faded image. I finally had a family. They were gone, but they were real, and they had loved me. Margaret Sullivan became a regular visitor, then a close friend. She had known Thomas and Linda in college before everything fell apart, and she shared stories that made them real to me for the first time. She told me about Thomas's terrible jokes and Linda's infectious laugh, about the way they looked at each other like no one else existed, about the plans they had made for the future they never got to live. Every story was a gift. Every memory was a treasure. I also took over Holland Properties and ran it with the integrity my grandfather had always valued. But my real passion became something new: a nonprofit I created called Linda's Foundation. It provides financial counseling and support to women who are rebuilding their lives after trauma, divorce, or loss. Women who feel invisible. Women who have been told they are not enough. Women like I used to be. Every time I help one of them stand a little taller, I feel my mother's spirit beside me, proud of what her daughter has become. 2 months after the trial ended, I drove to the cemetery where my family rests. Grandpa Walter's headstone stands between Thomas and Linda, 3 graves in a row, a family finally reunited. I brought flowers for each of them and knelt on the grass as autumn leaves drifted down around me. Grandpa, I said softly, you spent your last 18 months fighting for me. I promise I will not waste what you gave me. I moved to the next headstone. Dad, I never got to know you, but I know you loved Mom enough to marry her when everyone disapproved. I got my stubbornness from you. Finally, I knelt before my mother's grave, and my voice broke. Mom, I read your letter 100 times, every single word. You wanted me. You loved me. That is all I ever needed to know. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves around me, and I smiled through my tears. I found my name. I survived. And I am going to live a life that makes all 3 of you proud. 1 month later, a letter arrived from the National Archives. Inside was unexpected news. Thomas Holland had registered a small lakeside property under an LLC shortly before his death, a wedding gift for Linda that was never transferred after they passed. As his sole heir, I was the legal owner. I drove out to see it on a quiet Saturday morning. The property was overgrown, the small cabin barely standing, but the lake was beautiful, peaceful, and still exactly the kind of place where 2 young people in love might have dreamed of building a life together. I sat on the weathered dock with Linda's letter in my pocket, watching the sun rise over the water. You bought this for her, Dad, I whispered. A place to build a life together. I thought about Linda's foundation and the women I was helping rebuild their lives. Maybe this place could become something more. A retreat, a sanctuary, somewhere broken families could come to heal. But that was a future project. Today, I simply sat with the sunrise, the letter, and the quiet knowledge that I finally knew who I was. Dana Holland, daughter of Thomas and Linda, granddaughter of Walter, survivor, and for the first time in 36 years, completely at peace. Dana's story reminds us of something we often forget in the chaos of daily life. The people who are supposed to love us unconditionally sometimes fail us in the deepest ways, but their failure does not define our worth. For 36 years, Dana believed she was the problem. She believed she was unlovable, difficult, not good enough. Every cold glance from Helen, every dismissive comment from Trevor, every moment of being overlooked reinforced that painful belief. But none of it was true. Dana was never the problem. She was simply the target of someone else's jealousy, resentment, and fear. And the moment she discovered the truth, everything changed. If there is one lesson we can take from this story, it is this: trust your instincts. Dana always felt that something was wrong in her family, that the coldness she experienced went beyond normal favoritism. She was right. Our intuition often knows things before our conscious mind is ready to accept them. When something feels deeply wrong in a relationship, when someone's behavior toward you does not match what love should look like, pay attention. You are not imagining it. You are not being too sensitive. You are recognizing a truth that others may be working very hard to hide. The second lesson is equally important. Justice is not the same as revenge. Dana did not destroy Helen out of anger. She did not scream or threaten or seek to humiliate her in public. Instead, she documented the truth, worked with legal professionals, and let the system hold Helen accountable for her crimes. There is power in patience. There is strength in strategy. When someone wrongs you, the most effective response is not emotional reaction, but calculated action. Gather your evidence, know your rights, and let the consequences speak for themselves. Finally, Dana's story teaches us that it is never too late to find your true family. The people who share your blood are not always the people who love you best. Sometimes family is the grandfather who spent his final months fighting to reunite you with your truth. Sometimes family is a retired investigator who watched over you from a distance because she made a promise. Sometimes family is the memory of parents you never knew whose love for you was written in letters and preserved across decades. Family is not just who raised you. Family is who loves you. And that love can find you at any age in ways you never expected. Thank you for listening to Dana's story today. If her journey touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. We share new stories every week about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, finding strength they did not know they had, and discovering truths that change everything. Leave a comment below and tell us, Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed how you saw your own history, or have you ever felt invisible in your own family only to realize later that you were never the problem? Your stories matter to us, and we love hearing from you. Until next time, remember you deserve love, you deserve truth, and you are never alone.